It started with a smell. Not just any smell, a stench so powerful, so overwhelming, that an entire nation of 3 million people couldn't escape it. For weeks, they couldn't eat. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't even think straight. The sky above London in the summer of 1858 hung heavy with an odor so vile that men and women would stop in the streets and vomit. They would cover their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in chemicals, desperate to block out what they were breathing in, yet nothing worked. But what they didn't know was that this smell, this unbearable, relentless stench, was about to kill thousands of people. And the man who would stop it wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a scientist. He was a Scottish physician named John Snow, and an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. And their solution would change the world forever. This is the story of the Great Stink, and the men who solved it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But here's where it gets complicated. The people of London blamed the disease on something they couldn't see, something they called miasma, poisonous air, bad vapors rising from the river, evil odors that they believed carried death itself. They were terrified, absolutely terrified of something invisible. Scientists were completely baffled. The government was paralyzed by fear and indecision. And in the middle of all this chaos, nobody knew what was actually killing people. At least, that's what the authorities claimed. For decades, London had been struck by waves of cholera, a disease so mysterious and so catastrophic that it would claim the lives of entire families in a single night. The first outbreak came in 1831, claiming around 6,000 lives. Then came 1848 and 1849, when 14,000 Londoners died. And just 5 years later, in 1854, another outbreak would kill more than 10,000 people. Yet despite all this death, all this suffering, all this evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with London's water, the medical establishment refused to listen. London in the 1850s wasn't the glamorous imperial capital you might imagine from the history books. It was a nightmare of human suffering and filth beyond modern comprehension. The city had exploded in population. In just 50 years, from 1800 to 1850, London's population had surged from 1 million to 3 million people. Houses were packed so tightly together that neighbors could almost touch fingertips across the narrow streets. Children played in gutters filled with human waste. Families lived in cellars that flooded regularly with raw sewage. And there was one catastrophic problem that nobody had planned for, that nobody wanted to acknowledge: the disposal of human waste. Raw sewage ran through the streets like rivers. It seeped into wells where people drew their drinking water. It contaminated the water people used to cook their food, to bathe their children, to wash their clothes. The sewer system that existed was ancient and completely overwhelmed. Medieval wooden pipes were starting to be replaced with iron ones, but it was too little, too late. There were 200,000 cesspits scattered throughout London, pits beneath homes where waste accumulated and frequently leaked methane gas that would spontaneously ignite and explode. And worst of all, the government didn't care. They didn't care that people were dying. In the shadows of this chaos, working quietly in London's medical community, there was a man named Dr. John Snow. Born in York in 1813, the first of 9 children in a laborer's family, Snow had witnessed disease and poverty from his earliest years. As a young apprentice at age 14, he was sent to work for a surgeon in Newcastle, where he saw firsthand the ravages of cholera during the 1831 outbreak. He was just 18 years old when he attended to cholera victims in a coal mine, watching them die in agony, convulsed with cramps, losing massive amounts of fluid through violent diarrhea and vomiting until they simply collapsed from dehydration. That experience marked him forever. Snow made a vow to himself. He would understand this disease. He would find out what caused it. He would stop it. He became a physician, trained at the University of London, and even became Queen Victoria's personal anesthetist. But his true passion, his obsession, was understanding cholera. And he had an idea that would make him the enemy of every major medical authority in England. An idea so ahead of its time, so revolutionary, that the entire establishment would laugh at him, mock him, and refuse to listen to him. John Snow believed that cholera wasn't spread by foul air. He believed it was spread through contaminated water. In 1849, when another cholera outbreak struck London, Snow published a pamphlet titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. In this short work, he laid out his theory clearly. Cholera was a specific disease that spread from person to person through water contaminated with human feces. It was a radical idea. It was considered absurd. The medical establishment had already decided that cholera came from miasma, from bad air. The theory of miasma was supported by luminaries like Edwin Chadwick and even Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse. These were giants of the medical world, and they all believed in bad air. If you asked any doctor in London in 1850 what caused cholera, they would tell you it was poisonous vapors rising from rotting organic matter. The idea that it came through water, through something as mundane and common as drinking water, was considered ridiculous. It was almost offensive. It suggested something too unpleasant to contemplate, that people were literally drinking the fecal matter of cholera victims. It suggested that sewage was infiltrating water supplies. It suggested that the entire city's infrastructure was contaminated. Doctors didn't want to hear it. The government didn't want to hear it. And so, Snow's pamphlet was largely ignored. He was dismissed as a crank, an outlier, a medical eccentric with an absurd theory. But John Snow didn't care what they thought. He kept investigating. He kept collecting data. He kept watching the patterns of the disease. Then came August 1854. Another cholera outbreak had struck the poor district of Soho in central London. Golden Square and the neighborhoods surrounding it were packed with tenements, subdivided rental rooms, and the absolute dregs of London's poverty-stricken population. It was a place where nearly every household had a cesspit beneath it, where the sanitation was non-existent, where the stench was constant. On the 31st of August, 1854, the first cases appeared. A baby named Frances Lewis, the daughter of Sarah Lewis, became violently ill with severe diarrhea and vomiting. Within 4 days, on September 2nd, 1854, the baby died. Frances was dead. Sarah Lewis, in her grief and desperation, washed out her daughter's contaminated clothes and tipped the washing water into a cesspool directly outside her house. That single act would set off a chain reaction of death that would ultimately affect hundreds of people. Within days, more cases appeared. Within a week, the streets of Soho were becoming a nightmare of death. By September 10th, just 10 days after the outbreak began, over 500 people were dead. The death toll was rising exponentially. People were dropping dead in their homes, in the streets, in hospitals. Families were being wiped out. Children were dying. Entire households were being consumed by the disease. It was catastrophic. It was apocalyptic. But while panic gripped the streets of Soho, John Snow was doing something different. He was investigating. He was collecting data. He went from house to house, interviewing survivors, recording addresses, mapping out where each person who died had lived. He asked people where they got their water. He asked them what they drank. He asked them about their habits. Most importantly, he began to notice a pattern that nobody else was seeing. The deaths, almost all of them, were clustering around a single location in Soho. They were clustering around Broad Street, now known as Broadwick Street, and specifically around a public water pump, a single communal pump that served the neighborhood. This wasn't a random distribution of death. This wasn't an even spread across the district. The deaths were concentrated, tightly clustered, around one specific water source. Snow began mapping the cases on paper, marking each death with a black bar on a street map. As he placed bar after bar after bar on the map, a picture emerged that was absolutely undeniable. The concentration of deaths around the Broad Street pump was overwhelming. But there was one problem. Snow examined the water from the pump himself. He looked at it closely. He examined it with a microscope. The water looked clean. It smelled fine. There was no visible contamination, at least nothing that could be seen with the technology of the time. This created a contradiction. How could clean-looking water be poisoning people? But Snow pressed on. He began digging deeper. It was at this point that John Snow received crucial help from an unexpected ally. The Reverend Henry Whitehead was an assistant curate at St. Luke's Church in Soho, and he was initially a believer in the miasma theory. But as he witnessed the horror unfolding in his parish, as he visited the dying and the grieving, he began to doubt the accepted explanations. He began to listen to John Snow. Together, Snow and Whitehead conducted what would later be called the first great epidemiological investigation in history. They combined scientific observation with personal interviews. They talked to people who survived cholera and asked them what they drank. They found that brewery workers in the area had not gotten cholera because they drank beer brewed on the premises, not water from the pump. They found that poorhouse residents who used a different water source had not gotten cholera. The pattern was becoming clearer and clearer. Whitehead helped Snow trace the contamination to its source. They investigated the pump well itself and discovered something horrifying. The public well had been dug only 3 feet away from an old cesspit. The brick lining of that cesspit had begun to leak. Raw fecal matter was seeping directly into the water supply that people were drinking, cooking with, and washing with. They traced the source of the outbreak to baby Frances Lewis. Her contaminated diapers, washed by her mother Sarah Lewis and emptied into that cesspool, had leaked into the pump. That single infected baby had started a chain reaction that had killed more than 600 people in 10 days. When John Snow presented his findings to the authorities on September 7, 1854, he faced absolute resistance. The local board of guardians didn't believe him. A local doctor named Edwin Lancaster later remembered the reaction. He was not believed, not a member of his own profession, not an individual in the parish believed that Snow was right. They looked at his maps. They looked at his data. But they couldn't accept his conclusion because it contradicted everything they believed about disease. The miasma theory had such a powerful grip on the establishment, such institutional weight, that the evidence simply didn't matter. How could they admit that disease came from sewage in the water when they had spent decades insisting it came from bad air? That would mean admitting they were wrong. That would mean admitting that London's entire approach to public health was fundamentally flawed. But Snow was persistent. He convinced them, slowly, reluctantly, to at least try removing the pump handle. Not because they believed him, but just to try it. Just to see what would happen. On September 8, 1854, the authorities removed the handle from the Broad Street pump. People couldn't draw water from it anymore. And almost immediately, the new cases of cholera stopped appearing. The disease that had been killing hundreds of people was suddenly halted. But even this wasn't enough to convince the establishment. Even after the pump was closed and the outbreak subsided, the authorities replaced the handle. They didn't accept Snow's theory. They merely acted to quell an emergency. Here's the tragedy at the heart of this story. John Snow's evidence was overwhelming. His data was compelling. His logic was undeniable. But the medical world remained unconvinced. The General Board of Health refused to officially accept his theory. The Committee for Scientific Inquiries concluded that disease spread either in air or water, refusing to give Snow full credit. For 4 more years, Snow fought for recognition of his work. He published a detailed treatise in 1855 incorporating all his research. He presented his findings to anyone who would listen. But the establishment had dug in its heels. Snow was ahead of his time by decades. Germ theory, the scientific basis that would eventually prove him completely right, wouldn't be established until Louis Pasteur's work in the early 1860s. Snow didn't understand bacteria. He didn't understand pathogens. He only understood patterns. He only understood evidence. And he trusted that evidence more than he trusted the consensus of his time. It was a revolutionary act of intellectual courage. But it came at a price. On June 16, 1858, at only 45 years old, John Snow died. He suffered a stroke and passed away. He died at the height of what was about to become the Great Stink. He died just months before his theory would be vindicated, before the stench of London would force the government to act, before Joseph Bazalgette would use his discoveries as the foundation for a new sewage system. Snow never lived to see his vindication. He never saw his work accepted. He never saw the lives his theory would ultimately save. Between 1854 and 1858, the situation in London deteriorated steadily. The population continued to explode. More people meant more sewage. The old sewer system, already overwhelmed, was pushed to the breaking point. The Thames, once a river, had become essentially an open sewer. Raw human waste poured into it constantly. Slaughterhouse waste, industrial chemicals, the detritus of 3 million people, all of it flowed into the Thames. The river stank constantly. The smell was a permanent feature of London life, especially in the summer months. Citizens complained. Newspapers wrote editorials. Charles Dickens famously satirized the situation, writing about the Thames as a deadly sewer. Politicians acknowledged the problem, but did nothing. The Metropolitan Commission of Sewers was responsible for the situation, but lacked the power to make changes. Any attempt at reform was seen as despotic interference in local liberties. There was an institutional paralysis, a refusal to act despite mounting evidence of catastrophe. And then came the summer of 1858. It was the hottest summer on record. For weeks, temperatures soared. The sun beat down relentlessly on London. And as the heat increased, something happened that had been building for years. Centuries of waste in the Thames began to ferment. All that decomposing organic matter, all that human and animal waste, all that industrial effluent, started literally cooking in the scorching heat. The gases produced by this decomposition began to rise into the air. The smell became something that was previously unimaginable. By July 1858, the smell from the Thames had become legendary in its awfulness. Contemporary accounts describe it as a wall of stench, a solid, physical thing you had to walk through. People would cover their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in cologne, vinegar, or chemical solutions. Nothing helped. The smell penetrated everything. It seeped through windows. It made its way into homes and shops. Workers on the Thames could barely function. Men would gag and vomit from the stench. Stories spread of people being struck down by the odor itself, as if the smell could physically attack you. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert attempted to take a pleasure cruise on the Thames near Deptford, they had to turn back within minutes. The smell was so terrible, so absolutely revolting, that the Queen of England couldn't tolerate it. Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, declared that the Thames had become a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. The press began calling it the Great Stink. Parliament, which had only recently been rebuilt beside the river, was nearly evacuated. Between 250 tons of lime were being spread on the riverbanks and mouths of sewers in a desperate attempt to mask the smell. But there was no masking it. There was no escaping it. The entire city was choking on its own waste. And perhaps most tellingly, the elite and the powerful were no longer exempt. If the poor had to suffer through this stench in their neighborhoods, now the politicians had to suffer through it in their workplace. The proximity of Parliament to the source of the stench, quite literally, concentrated the minds of politicians in a way that 4 years of pleading by public health advocates never could. When cholera was killing poor people in Soho, when John Snow was presenting evidence that the water was contaminated, when thousands of ordinary Londoners were dying, the government had done nothing. But now, when Parliament couldn't sit in comfort, when the stench was affecting the powerful, suddenly there was political will. Suddenly there were funds available. Suddenly action was possible. Parliament passed the Metropolis Management Amendment Act with remarkable speed. They authorized the Metropolitan Board of Works to begin an immediate and comprehensive overhaul of London's entire sewage system. The chief engineer of this massive undertaking was Joseph Bazalgette. Born in 1819, Bazalgette had already spent years drawing up plans for a new sewage system. He had been appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856, and he had been waiting, watching, accumulating data, preparing designs for a solution that nobody wanted to fund. The Great Stink changed everything. Bazalgette's proposal called for a series of interconnecting sewers that would carry waste eastward, away from London, toward the Thames estuary far downstream. These sewers would be underground, concealed from public view. The design included high-level, mid-level, and low-level sewer systems, with pumping stations to lift the sewage into the higher pipes. It would require new embankments along the Thames, the Victoria, Chelsea, and Albert embankments, which would not only hide the sewers, but also protect the city from flooding. It was audacious. It was expensive. But it was exactly what London needed. What made Bazalgette's plan even more remarkable was his foresight, his almost prophetic understanding of how the city would grow. When calculating the diameter of the pipes needed for London's current population of 3 million people, he deliberately doubled the size to account for what he called the unforeseen. He was designing a system not just for the London of 1858, but for the London of the future. That decision, made more than a century and a half ago, proved to be genius. The system Bazalgette designed would eventually grow to accommodate a population far exceeding 3 million. By the 1890s, London's population had reached 6 million, yet his system continued to function. Even today, in the 21st century, Bazalgette's sewers remain the backbone of London's sanitation. The construction began in 1859 and would take over a decade to complete. It was the largest infrastructure project Victorian England had ever undertaken. Excavations on a massive scale took place throughout central London. Tunnels were constructed to house pumping stations and treatment plants. 400 draftsmen worked on detailed plans and sectional views for the first phase of construction alone. Between 1859 and 1875, Bazalgette's team would construct 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. They would build 1,100 miles of street sewers. They would create 4 pumping stations and 2 treatment works. They would build the Victoria, Chelsea, and Albert embankments. The project required 318 million bricks and 880,000 cubic yards of concrete and mortar. The final cost was approximately £6.5 million, an enormous sum for the time. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. What gives it its deeper meaning? Joseph Bazalgette's entire plan was ultimately based on the research of the man who had been laughed at and dismissed for years. Bazalgette understood, as the government was finally beginning to understand, that John Snow had been right all along. The sewage had to be separated from the water supply. The contamination had to stop. The system Bazalgette built would do exactly what Snow had proposed years earlier. It would prevent sewage from entering drinking water. By finally implementing the solution that Snow had identified in 1854, London would be freed from cholera. The 1866 cholera outbreak, which occurred 4 years before Bazalgette's system was fully completed, provided the final proof of Snow's theory. That outbreak struck the east end of London, an area that had not yet been connected to the new sewer system. The outbreak killed 5,596 people, yet the rest of London, which had been connected to Bazalgette's system, remained completely untouched by cholera. The contrast was undeniable. In the areas served by the new sewers, cholera was gone. In the area without the system, cholera raged. Snow's waterborne theory was finally accepted. His evidence was finally vindicated. His legacy was finally recognized. John Snow, the man who had been mocked and dismissed, the man who had died before his work was acknowledged, became known as the founding father of modern epidemiology. Universities studied his work. Medical schools taught his methods. Scientists praised his logic and his courage. Universities now honor him. The John Snow Society meets at a pub named in his honor. Every year, the Pump Handle Lecture is delivered to address contemporary public health challenges. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.